welcome everyone. Welcome to the panel entitled The Future of the Internet, a Digital Rights Approach. And as you may have guessed from the title of this session, our ambitious goal today is nothing less than to look into the future and try to imagine together what the internet will be like. And to do so, I have the pleasure and really the honor to speak with three digital rights experts who will delve into the emerging trends that are shaping our digital world. So Caroline de Kock is with us, Diego Naranjo, and Alex Krasodomski-Jones. Caroline is the coordinator for C4C. She's the broad-based coalition that seeks an informed debate on how copyright can more effectively promote innovation, access, and creativity. C4C represents libraries, scientific and research institutions, consumers, digital rights groups, technology businesses, and educational institutions. Diego is head of policy at IDRI. He joined in 2014. He advocates for the protection of citizens' fundamental rights and freedoms online. In the past, Diego gained experience in the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, and the Free Software Foundation Europe. And last but not least, Alex is director of digital at the think tank Demos. He leads Demos' efforts in the Good Web Project, a coalition of civil society organizations working to articulate, measure, and advocate for an internet governed on open, liberal, and democratic principles. His focus is on building an evidence base, both of what good practice looks like in the architecture and practices of future online spaces, and of public and government consensus around that future. So it's an honor to have you on this panel. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation. So over the next hour or so, we'll address issues around open access to information, privacy, data protection, fundamental freedoms, including, of course, free expression. I hope we'll be able to identify the threats, but also the opportunities for the internet to support freedom, justice, democracy, innovation, a long list of things we want to accomplish in the digital age. And personally, I'm really looking forward to hearing about our panelists' insights into what our digital future might look like. So now our conversation, like I said, is really designed to follow a digital rights approach. So Caroline, I would like to start with you and ask you, what does the concept of digital rights mean to you? And of course, Alex and Diego, you're welcome to share your perspectives as well. But how about you start us off, Caroline?
Thanks, Brigitte. And the reason I think I want to start with the digital rights aspect is because I'm a lawyer, so talking about the technology aspect would be risky at best. To me, the biggest problem at the moment, at this stage, and I've been active in the internet law space for 25 years, is that the question we should ask ourselves is both, what are digital rights, and should we differentiate between digital and offline rights, or just simply see them as two sides of the same fundamental rights coin? It has become increasingly clear over the past years, and certainly if you've been active in the EU bubble, that if we ask for digital rights, some policymakers seem to think these rights can be different from the ones we're granted in the offline world. And more that different means that our rights online are interpreted by some as being weaker than the ones we are granted offline. So we're basically losing rights in the online world. And that may sound dramatic, but I'll just give a few short examples. Just look at your content consumption. In the digital world, in most cases, you no longer own the content you think you're buying. You just rent it. You can't just pass on a good ebook to your best friend. And in some cases, a movie that you thought you owned in your library just suddenly disappears. Also in the real world, when you enter a pub, they normally do not ask you to verify your identity just in case you say something obnoxious after a few beers. Sure, they see your face, but then again, in the online world, you also leave traces that make you findable if law enforcement, for example, wanted to find you. No one is supposed to open your letters under normal circumstances or enter your house without a warrant in the offline world. And also, when a decision must be made about your freedom of speech, no one so far has replaced courts in the offline world with a private call center with overworked, understaffed people that will deliver judgments on your rights within 24 hours, or more likely by a robot that will react according to the biases it was programmed with. Those are all things that we would not accept in the offline world, and we shouldn't accept them in the online world. In Brussels, the mantra at the moment is to say, if it's illegal offline, it should be illegal online. Well, I think we should push it back and say, if it's legal offline, it should be legal online, and reclaim our rights to a certain extent. And I'm not saying that legislators are trying to chip away at people's rights. I don't think that is their intention. I think that's part of those unintended consequences that happen when legislators write legislation that is supposed to cover something as complex as the internet. And it happens because there's a lot of misconceptions about what the internet is. A lot of people seem to think it's the fourth dimension. And that's why we have that offline-online dichotomy. But if you look at real life, when you're in your house and you take your car and you go on the highway, no one thinks that these are two different worlds, house and outside, and that fundamental rights are different. And the same should be true in the future of the internet, even if we know that the internet raises specific challenges because it's global. I think also there's a conception of the internet and of technology as magic. Things will be solved through technology, and God knows that algorithms and filters, etc., have been thrown at us in the copyright world. Also, I think sometimes internet is seen as the source of problems. And whilst that's true in some cases, in other cases, it just shines a light on society's problems. Even though, it might exacerbate some of them, it might create some of them. And in some cases, quite honestly, it solves some problems or it mitigates them. I mean, just imagine the COVID pandemic without the internet. And then finally, I think also when we think about digital rights, we need to remember that the internet is not just big tech. The reason I'm saying that is because for the past years, a lot of policymaking has been driven by crusades. So people are launching crusades against gatekeepers, terrorists, pedophiles, and those crusades can serve fundamental rights. But sometimes also our rights become collateral damage, as we've seen with recent files like copyright and the terrorist content regulation. Because crusades often generate a tunnel vision where the objectives of the crusade justify everything, including chipping away at our rights. So you lose a piece of privacy there, you lose a bit of freedom of speech here, but the crusade is happy because we're going after something, we're fixing a problem. So to me, maybe we should stop talking about digital rights, and I realize that I'm taking away the D of EDRI, but we can replace it with Diego in there. But I think we need to stick to fundamental rights everywhere and claim them back and submit every new piece of legislation to what I call the offline-online test. So that means that for every rule in place or envisaged, legislators should assess if they protect fundamental rights equally offline and online. If something's legal offline, should be legal online. If I'm allowed to own my content offline, I should be allowed to own it online. We need to reclaim our rights. And hopefully the end result would then be that if we apply that off-on test, our rights should not be weakened online versus offline and vice versa. I mean, in mathematical terms, I guess you could say the result would always reflect the highest common denominator of protection. I think only then, if that logic is applied moving forward, the future of the internet will be one where fundamental rights will have their place. Again, I think they had. I think it's under strain at the moment, but I think we can come to a better internet in the future. I really believe that, and we just need to be more. We need to ask more from legislators, and we need to ask more accountability for the players that are active on the internet, big and small at different layers, but for all of them. And that's my thought.
Thank you. That was very rich. I wonder if Diego or Alex, you want to comment directly on this item, on this concept of digital rights, or we can continue. Yeah.
I'd like to jump in very quickly because I do agree with Caroline, surprisingly. So I'm not sure we can change the D for Diego in Edry, but what we are trying to do, something that we can do for now, is that we are starting to talk about human rights on the digital age. That's the way we try to approach it. In fact, in the last 2 to 3 years, we've been broadening our scope of work from the typical geeky privacy activity, which is our core. I mean, we are a network almost 20 years old now, and that's how we started. But we are starting to go to outside of that comfort zone, let's say, and we're talking about worker rights when they are workers under surveillance, for example, in Amazon warehouses, or we're talking about discrimination, we're talking about racism and tech, we're talking about predictive policing, how that affects certain communities, certain types of groups. So just to say my +1 to Caroline, I think that's a good approach. And on the issue of offline and online, I think that test is a good, and I like the idea of pushing back with the whatever is legal online should be legal, what's legal offline should be legal online. But and more specifically, when we're trying to do something, trying to respect fundamental rights in the European Union legislation generally. Rather than talking about privacy or freedom of expression, any other fundamental right, I see myself mostly defending the necessity and proportionality test. So whenever these authorities come with a great idea to either fight big tech or fight child abuse or fight terrorism, I always try to go to, okay, this is an invasion of this or that, or could limit these fundamental rights in this way or not. And please go and see if this is really necessary for the legitimate goals that you're trying to achieve, and how all of this is proportionate. And in many cases, they do not pass this test, but sometimes because they are pushed because of political agenda, sometimes because there's not enough reaction, we fail to achieve our goals. Sometimes we win, so it's not that we lose all the time. But just those my 2 cents on what Caroline said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this idea of proportionality, I think, is also similar to this idea of balance that's in the copyright system, which is also one of the major frameworks that governs sharing of information online. But I also had another question for Caroline before moving to Alex and Diego. Often when we imagine the future, we have either a very rosy, like utopic vision, or we can have a very dark and dystopian vision of the future. Where do you situate yourself? Where do you think we're going into the future?
Well, when 25 years ago I started working on internet law, I actually started as a researcher on the first book on law in Europe. And we were 20 young law students, and the person writing the book briefed us about what he wanted to do. And at the end, we raised our hand and we said, "What's the internet?" Because back then, if you were a young lawyer in Europe, you were still dictating on a dictaphone and having other people type things for you. And so back then I had a very, once I discovered the internet, thanks to Canadian hackers actually that taught us what the internet was, I had a very utopian version of the vision of the internet. It was like amazing, no dust on the law books, everything to discover. I didn't think it was the wild, wild west, because that I still think is a stupid concept. I don't think laws are written for an online or an offline world. I think laws are written for human beings and to apply to situations that human beings live under. And so claiming that laws do not apply to the internet is ridiculous. I think the issue that we've found with the internet is that there's rarely a sheriff on the internet. and that most of the legislation actually has outsourced the role of the sheriff to the owner of the liquor store, which is not a good situation to be in. Since then, I've moved away from the utopia, as you can imagine, especially after 7 years of lobbying the copyright directive. No utopia left whatsoever about the internet. But I'm still hopeful. I've when we talked before this, when we exchanged ideas, I said I'm starting to think about protopia, which is that that vision of the internet where it gets better in small incremental steps every time, and we try to achieve those steps every time. I think that's what we can't accept, that it continues becoming a surveillance society. That needs to stop. And we need to hold those that push it there accountable for it. But I think we can't accept either to only talk about the negative of the internet. Big tech is big tech. And there was an article not that long ago that says the internet has a Facebook problem. Maybe that's true. But to me, the internet in itself, this Creative Commons doing a summit for 4 days and having people across the world talking to each other, that's the internet too. And that's fascinating, that's great, and thank God that that's still happening.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel that your point is really about how the internet is actually a mirror of larger problems, and there's no quick way to fix it. I think, as you said, you use the word incremental. It seems like it's going to be a step-by-step progress, if there is going to be any, and we just have to be prepared to engage in a longer dialogue. I would have the same question for Diego and Alex. What's your vision? Is it more on the side of utopia or of dystopia? Or somewhere in between, like Caroline?
I think it depends a little bit what day you catch me in, really, and who I've been talking to. It's quite easy to feel utopian after 5 days of Creative Commons. I suppose generally speaking, I find myself optimistic if you think about it from a development perspective, in terms of, do we still have the opportunity to create new tools, new solutions, new alternatives to current business models, current protocols, current ways of operating online? Well, yeah, we do, and there continues to be development in those spaces. I suppose the question it raises for me, and the question I had for Caroline was, we talk about a kind of incremental, step-by-step process. Who are you looking to take the next step? Is it government? Is it Facebook? Is it Google? Is it a crypto developer, building out a new protocol for moneyed exchange of ideas online? What are the organizations, or who are the forces that you are really excited about sort of taking the next step? Because when I look to I loved the point you made about sort of almost regulation by crusade or coverage by scandal. We've had the Wall Street Journal most recently, with the Facebook files and so on. And it feels like our kind of method of operating in this space is scandal. That's how we create change in a platform like, within big tech. We create a scandal, and then something maybe changes and probably doesn't. I'd love to sort of ask Caroline, who are you sort of most excited for in terms of what their next step might look like in making a better internet?
If I knew that, probably I'd be at a venture capitalist making a lot of money. If I had the perfect answer to that one. I'm still utopian enough to think that change will come from users, from what users expect, ask, how they vote with their feet. And at the moment, they can't vote with their feet half of the time because there's no interoperability between the platforms they use. That needs to come. And then if people say this is what we want, the internet normally responds and supplies. At the moment, in too many cases, people step into platforms not fully realizing what they are losing by using a service or going on a platform. And once they're captured on it, they can't really leave. Now, I'm not, I have teenagers at home, and honestly, the whole discussions about some of the big tech do not seem that relevant anymore to me, because I don't see my teenagers using half of that big tech anymore. They're not even there anymore. We're talking about places where, young people just go, that's for old people, and no one is there. Doesn't mean that we need to accept the problems that are occurring there, and it doesn't mean that we can't use some of those examples to do better. And to get, my small steps are educating my kids and the kids around them, and my mom. Believe me, COVID has been very, very bad for old people in terms of spending time on the internet. But trying to educate as many people on what they should, what they should accept and not accept, and where they should move away from places if they're not getting what they deserve. I think we need to be more about, we deserve more, and you need to deliver it, or you need to leave, or we will leave you. Let's put it that way. That's probably the easier way. I'm not sure that's a good answer, but
if I can jump in, for us, it's very common for our community, but the digital rights community, at least in Europe, to tend towards being very dystopian and being very negative, talking about 1984, Big Brother, and so on. We have the Big Brother awards and so on. But I think it's time to move on from that. That was good for 15 plus years, but I think as with climate change, we don't gain much support by scaring people and telling them it's the apocalypse, because people tend to not do anything. So I cannot do anything, it's already lost. So I think we try to rather frame it as what is the internet we want to see in 5, 10, 20 years from now, and how do we want to democratize it? Because as Alex was asking, who should do this? Should be Google, should be Facebook? I think it was being provocative on purpose. And for me, I'm going to be provocative as well. I'm going to be old school and say that the state should be the one with whom we should be trusting, not blindly. I think it should be a state in the way that is, is really democratic, has people's demand on the core and not corporate demands, as it happens in many of our societies. That is, that lets people thrive and lets people engage and fights social inequalities and so on. So quite far from where we are in most of the states. But in general, what I want to tend to is to, if we want to have a different internet, and some of us have an idea of how that could look like, we need to put money on it. And we already did. The internet the infrastructure is publicly funded. It was created with a lot of public funding. Most of the items, the parts of your iPhone or your smartphone are created via lots of public funding. What Apple did was just put in a nice box and sell it to you. But mostly GPS, the Siri, the location, all of that is publicly funded. So I think it's time to get that public funding and make it our own, and make it our own infrastructure, make it our own Zoom, our own YouTube, our own things that are democratically run, democratically controlled, and that we don't go into these liquor stores that Caroline was saying before, where the liquor store owner is the one telling us what to do and what not to do in our society. I think that's profoundly anti-democratic. So I think, again, going back to the initial question, we need to be optimistic and rather think, okay, what kind of internet, what kind of societies we want, and what do we need to do that? And I think more democracy in all stages, including public funding for technology and for alternatives to current corporate private systems is one of the ways to do that.
Right. And you started saying that your answer was a bit old school, but I think it's quite a modern stream of thought happening now with, I don't know if you're aware of this digital public infrastructure that's promoted by Professor Ethan Zuckerman in the United States. I think it's also based on this idea of digital spaces that would be built using public funds. I wonder what your thoughts are on this. Would that be a good future? Would that be something that would promote fundamental rights in the future on the internet?
And as you described, this sounds good to me. I come from the Mariana Mazzucato type of view. I think that's how I approach all of this. I mean, we look at the COVID-19 vaccines, a different topic. 95% of that is public funded. How is that controlled by a monopoly of 2-3 companies, and we are allowing the 99% of the world to not having vaccine? I think that's a crime. It should be a crime. And so, in the same way, we need to look at it as, okay, we put money on it. Perhaps even, I think what Mariana Mazzucato often mentions is, I think the private sector has a role to play. Why not? But then let's ensure that at least part of it comes back to us at some point, not giving patents forever, or not giving copyright forever, but rather bringing back to the public domain where it belongs, because it was publicly funded and it should be publicly controlled. So that's what I wanted to get at.
Mm-hmm. And so if we've been talking more about the future, I'd like to take us back to the here and now. For you, Diego, what would be your priorities now, today, if you want to build the future that you want to see? What's the situation in Europe? What is your main focus?
I always think of, when I think about the internet and digital rights and what are our priorities, I always think that what Cory Doctorow say once in one event in Germany, he was saying that he believes there are many more urgent matters than so-called digital rights. We're talking about climate change, social inequalities, and so on. But those people who are going to get together to fight these problems will be using mostly the internet in one way or another to gather people, to write text, to organize protests. And that's why, in a way, digital rights or human rights in the online world become more important. And we're trying to frame our priorities in the next 5 years in 3 different areas. The first one is open internet and inclusive technologies, which is a very broad title. But what we mean with that is things like the regulation of artificial intelligence. We're talking about fighting against predictive policing, social scoring, the use of AI in the borders. There's a project of using lie detectors, using facial recognition in the EU borders, where theoretically those machines will see if the asylum seeker is lying or not, which will give them asylum rights or not. And also we're trying to fight against facial recognition. We have a big campaign called Reclaim Your Face, trying to fight all of that. So that's the first bucket. Then the second one, which is related, and of course all of these things overlap. The second one is privacy and data protection. So we want ensure that the data protection standards are well implemented. We want to advocate for more encryption to protect private communications. We saw what happened in the summer with Apple's attempt to try to scan all of the private communications and scan the iCloud backups in order to look for child sex abuse material. So I think it's a trend. It doesn't come from us, but it's a trend that we need to fight back and ensure that our privacy remains respected, even when we have these huge threats. And the third bucket for us is what we call information democracy, another broad term. But then we put things like freedom of expression online, including copyright in the broadest sense, trying to protect freedom of expression to share, to receive and impart information. We talk about platform regulation. And then we talk about interoperability that Caroline was mentioning before. And another thing that we're trying to fight back is the surveillance-based advertising model, what is called also ad tech. And I saw yesterday how even the NSA and the CIA are using ad blockers because they know how these ads are so pervasive and so dangerous. So if they do it, I think we need to follow back and fight them and try to phase them out as soon as possible. So those are our 3 buckets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'll be busy, I'm sure.
Yes, we won't be bored.
You won't be bored. And yeah, it sounds like we're going to get into a future where it will be, maybe run by machines if we don't intervene, right? Is that a real risk? Is that something that you can see in our future? Alex, I know you've been thinking about this, of a world that would be run by technology, by machines. Is that something that we have to be worried about?
Well, that was a sort of demos addition to a really, really, I think it's now a book actually, a paper by Kieran O'Hara and Wendy Hall called it's called the 3 Internets, or the 5 Internets, or the 10 Internets, or something. It's a phenomenal paper. I'm sure somebody can link it in the chat. Sort of outlining kind of what these different internets out there might look like, and the sort of the authoritarian internet versus the Silicon Valley corporate internet. And we sort of applied a layer to that, which was sort of thinking about what a machine internet would look like. And some of that is kind of looking forward to a kind of decentralized technology world, digital autonomous organizations, obviously cryptocurrency, but also just generally what happens when there is machine power. And obviously we got a lot of pushback because everybody would sort of tell us that, well, AI and algorithms, these are not machines, these are just sort of extensions of the humans that own those technologies, that your predictive algorithm that runs, that recommends me things on YouTube or recommends me things on Twitter or whatever, they are just basically a function of human power or a function of corporate power. But really, I think there is something that is sort of different about when, as lots of the examples that Diego shared, when a machine is making a decision, and when a machine like an artificial intelligence is making a decision, and how contestable that decision is, and how easily and how transparent a decision is made, and the scale at which decisions can be taken. When you pass those decisions onto a machine, I do think that you make a choice about where you put power when you hand it over to a machine. This is the example we always used when we were thinking about our own technology here at Chasm. So we are a sort of strange mix of policy wonks, for want of a better word, and computer scientists on the other side. And so we build technology, and the idea was almost like, I'm sure you've seen these sort of exoskeletons that the military is building, that you strap in and then you can lift up really heavy loads. And we sort of wanted our technology to do the same thing, where if you could help an expert in radicalization, train a machine learning algorithm, could they help identify examples of extremist content, and could we kind of get them to work, in synthesis with one another? But when you then change that sort of, when you change that paradigm and you have artificial intelligences that really try to, use deep learning and come to decisions based on the understanding of the data itself, and sort of run their own scripts, often in ways which the original analyst doesn't understand, the person who trained the data. I mean, they say this a lot about the Google search algorithm, that nobody really knows, that from A to Z exactly how it works. And I think the same is going to be true increasingly as we go forward, as artificial intelligences appear to make very good decisions at great speed and across great scale, that we should just give over more decisions to them. And I think that is often will be a very reasonable thing to do. But I do think that leads itself to this kind of concentration of what I would think of as machine power that is worth thinking about and potentially worth putting checks and balances around. So that's kind of where I come at with at least one way of thinking about machines as one node of power against the state and corporations and individuals and machines.
Yeah, that's very interesting to look at machines as a form of power. Carolyn, I know you have a lot of thoughts about this.
Yeah, I fight against other machines. I agree with Alex in the sense that with artificial intelligence and with the power of algorithms, and some things will be improved or sped up or become better. I mean, I've seen applications, for examples, where radios of certain of lungs, for example, the machine was better than the doctor at identifying potential cancer, spreads in lungs than the human eye, just because it had learned over millions of radios X-rays how to identify. So I think in certain circumstances, yes, obviously technology will bring benefits. Whereas C4C, for example, we find it more difficult to accept our overlords, the robots, to a certain extent, is when you apply it to very nuanced things such as speech. because speech is not just about words, it's about context. And at the moment, there is no AI that can grapple with context. It can grapple with words, and it can grapple with images, and it can, match things with each other, but it can't see the difference between a terrorist organization uploading a terrorist video with awful material on it and a news outlet reporting about that video. I mean, those are the same images, but the context is entirely different. And so I think when we look at AI, when we look at all the progress and that technology can bring, we also need to be humble in terms of what can be achieved with technology, and sometimes step back and say, if we've accepted that courts take several years in certain circumstances to weigh and balance rights in complex situations, maybe we shouldn't accept that algorithms are requested to do that within 24 hours, which is the case, for example, in content moderation for a lot of issues. Or less, 30 minutes, I think, is one of the proposals at the moment in the DSA for sports streaming, because obviously the whole of Europe's fundamental rights and economy is threatened by people watching 30 seconds of a goal online. It depends on what you use it for, let me put it that way. And I think there's marvelous uses of technology and of algorithms, and then there's uses where maybe we should be a bit more careful.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I think it centers on the purpose of the use, and that technology can be put to good use, and it could be put to uses that are more problematic. And the whole trick is to be able to tell the difference. And making those decisions will indeed shape what the internet will look like, right? It's by making these decisions that we will determine what is good, what is not good, and we might end up with a completely different picture depending on the choices that we make. And I know that, Alex, you've been working on a project called the Good Web Project. So I'm really curious, what does good mean in that context?
Well, it's a good question. I think, we started this project a couple of years ago when the UK launched its online safety bill, which was, I mean, it's sort of, look, we've spent, it's quite easy to be surrounded, 5 days of Creative Commons, surrounded by lots and lots of brilliant people, all sort of working tirelessly to fight for a better internet and thinking about it in all these different ways, to forget that we are massively in the minority here. Like, as governments, as the media, and as the public, the media, the government, they do not know what good looks like. There are a few exceptions, none of them are good. We can explain that in a little bit as well, right? Like, if you think about the conversations that have been taking place in the media, but also at a political level, we know what bad looks like. And Caroline sort of spoke to this as well. We know what bad looks like: extremist recruitment, electoral abuse, cybercrime, hate speech, abuse of parliamentarians, disinformation. Every week there is a new sort of harm for the headlines. And I think that one of the challenges for us is to understand, well, why are we so bad at talking about what good looks like, and why are we so good at talking about what bad looks like? These kind of crusading approach to policy that Caroline sort of talks about really compellingly. And I think some of it is, there's lots of reasons, right? Some of it's technical. Some of it, I think, is hubris. Some of it is a hangover from the days. I joined Demos a couple of years after Tahrir Square and the Arab Spring, and we were all sort of clapping and excited at the sight of smartphones, in Twitter being used in Tahrir Square. That social media was the vanguard of democracy sweeping through the Middle East. Now, obviously, that story has changed a lot in 10 years, but I think we have a hangover from those conversations. I think we still think, maybe it could still be the vanguard of democracy if those clever nerds just sort their platforms out, please. Like, you've got loads of money, you must be able to fix this. Obviously, the spoiler here is I don't think they will. Some of it, I think, is a language gap, and I think this is really important. When the UK government says it wants the UK to be the safest place in the world to be on the internet, what does safe mean? What is it like when we're told to share more or share less? What does share mean? When we talk about private spaces online, as the UK Safety Bill does, when we talk about public spaces online, what is a public space online? What is I think that we need to find a way to sort of talk clearly and compellingly as a nation, and I think as allies, as in defense of a kind of free and open internet. So you have a kind of a hangover, you have a language gap. I think you also have short-sightedness within government and within the media, because while the architects of the internet sort of are thinking about tomorrow, we are very much thinking about yesterday. And that's a real problem, because Beijing knows what good looks like. Mark Zuckerberg knows what good looks like. Moscow probably knows what good looks like, right? Like, we are, as democracies, I think, reactive and stuttering often. And as if technology, and especially digital technology, is like something that happens to us, rather than something to, something to clean up, like an oil spill, rather than something that we're supposed to steer. And I think it's high time that we kind of come together as our friends and allies to sort of advocate for our own and demand that democracies make a case for an internet that they want, that is proactive, that is positive, rather than carved in relief, defined by subtraction from all the things that we don't like about the current model. And I think lastly, the last thing I'd say as to why I think it's difficult, or why democracies find it difficult to talk about a good internet, is that we often don't we don't often agree. No two democracies are alike, and there are things that we agree on in principle, and often in law, he says with trepidation, given Caroline's on the call, and things that we don't. Since the turn of the millennium, new democracies have emerged. Taiwan, but older democracies have started to realize that perhaps they're not quite as strong and stable as they perhaps thought that they were. And so we have the US and Taiwan and India and Germany. There is no consensus, I think, on what liberal democratic values really are, and certainly no consensus on how you would apply those values to the internet. So I think these are the kind of context of what, or the vacuum that we were sort of looking to try to fill with the Good Web Project, is to try to bring friends and partners and allies and people we kind of agreed with and people we disagreed with and people we definitely agreed with, to try to articulate, find the language, measure, find the examples of the things that we did like. We know that there's lots about the internet that is amazing, and I'll find sort of advocate for what the internet might look like. So for me, like, what does a good internet look like? Well, I mean, there's a lot of answers, but for me, I really want us to sort of flip the script a bit and come back to this idea of proactivity. Changes to the internet historically happen when people do things. Developers build stuff. That stuff forms the bedrock of what we now call digital society, whether they are protocols, whether they are platforms. And I think this is where I really want to see change, and where I'm actually optimistic for the future of the internet. I want to see change in in development, not in prod, to borrow a kind of programmer's phrase. Tacking a fact-checking service funded out of CSR money or a redirect method, tacking that to the side of a freewheeling technology like Facebook is a con. It's nonsensical. It is a waste of money, and I think it's 20 years too late anyway. We need to affect the ways in which the technology is being built, and I'm constantly in awe of organizations trying to do that in the face of what is a hyper uncompetitive market at the moment, under constant threat from the major technology platforms. So I suppose the Good Web Project is a call for innovation and support and celebration. I don't believe in sluggish, iterative changes to platforms like Facebook as a way to solve this, driven by scandal, driven by crusade, as Caroline says. I'm done with sort of PR exercise solutions that you sort of stick into a fundamentally broken platform and say, well, okay, Facebook is still, there's loads of disinformation here, but they now come with a fact-checking bubble. Don't buy it. I don't buy it. Pour that money into the people, the businesses and civil society that are trying something new, as Diego was sort of talking to. Celebrate them, fund them, and feed those demands into the lines of code and the standards and the protocols and the programs and the infrastructure that all of these new projects sit on. So that's kind of what I would hope.
So are you saying that we should stop trying to fix the internet and we should just try something new, build something new?
Yes.
Is that also how you see things, Caroline?
Well, I'm not an internet. He's a techie. I'm the lawyer. I see it in the sense that whatever we do with the internet, it needs to empower its users much more than they are at the moment. And by empowering, I mean giving them tools that allow them to, when they access the internet, when they talk to friends, whatever, they are much more in control. I mean, I've had some brainstormings recently about what a better internet looks like, and a lot of people were complaining about the lack of control. They just feel they're being, they're living the internet. They're not controlling what they do on the internet to a certain. And it's not necessarily because they're stupid or they're incapable of doing it, but just because they're captured in places, because that's where they need to be to talk to friends, etc. So that there's that empowerment, and that empowerment also comes from educating a lot more the next generations about what they can demand from the internet and not be shy about demanding it. Because let's be honest, the next generation is a plug and play generation. They've never had to put a little disk and do a DOS command and install something. They're using tools that in most cases don't even allow them. I mean, I recently read that in a college they're having to give courses on what folders are, because people don't know what a folder is anymore. That's not how young people. But all of that is part of a place they were put where there's less control and there's just living the internet, living the online, like it's a given that you can't shape. And you can shape it. That's if you tell people you can shape it, then there's a chance that what is being shaped is better than what we have currently.
Mm-hmm. And I think what you're saying is especially true if we consider that the internet plays a huge role in how the next generation is going to tackle global challenges, right? If it's a space to share information, how is the next generation going to be able to use the internet and exploit its benefits in order to tackle global challenges? And even coming back to the challenge that we face now, and I take the liberty of taking Matthew's question from the Q&A, the COVID-19 crisis. What do you think about, he mentions Bachelet and co invoking the right to share the benefits of science during the COVID-19 crisis? Does anyone have any takes on this? You talked about, more sharing, less sharing. At CC, we like to talk about better sharing. How does that play if we take a digital rights approach?
What do you understand by what does better sharing mean? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's a concept that we're currently shaping together with our community. I think a big part of it is about knowledge equity and access to knowledge, and making sure that there is an equitable sharing of knowledge. Right now, a lot of marginalized communities do not benefit from all the culture that's out there, all the knowledge that's otherwise accessible to only a privileged few. And I think that the internet should be much more equitable, should be much more accessible by all sorts of stakeholders within society. And right now, it doesn't seem like marginalized communities, minorities have the same access to knowledge, and that creates imbalances that leads to much larger societal problems.
If I may add, part of that has nothing to do with the internet, but has a lot to do with copyright laws and those type of legislations that even recently, for example, in South Africa, right holders try to block, and they're still trying to block, a review of the copyright law that would allow more access for blind people to copyrighted material. I mean, when we are in a situation where those things still happen, and where people are not on the barricade saying, seriously, you're trying to block access for blind people to content, your better sharing is kind of jeopardized by those type of reactionary interpretations of property and how you close the sharing of information. And I think we've seen the same thing with the COVID-19 crisis, where the discussions about TRIPS waivers of vaccination patents and things like that, well, they were smothered quite quickly by a couple of interests of countries that happen to have pharmaceutical companies in those countries. Surprise. So as long as the go-to reaction is to say, let's protect a couple of big companies or a couple of industrial or business interests, it's going to be a long road. Let's put it that way. And I've done that road during the 7 years of copyright directive. There's still a lot of knee-jerk going back to certain form of monopolies that are difficult to get out of policymakers, and that influence everything afterwards. I mean, there's no amount of technology that can ignore the monopoly that copyright is.
Mm-hmm. Alex, Diego, you want to add something to this?
Well, I'm going back to a previous point. I want to think about how to approach all of this and how to make the change. I think based on what Alex was saying before, and when he said innovation, it started to. I have some crippled effects, because for innovation in Brussels means we move forward with the AI agenda, whatever that means for people. So innovation means corporate power. Generally. So even though I know he didn't necessarily mean that. And the way we're trying to approach all of this is how can we bring democracy to the online world? We had a chat the other day in the EDRI office online, but we invited the trade unionists to talk about collective bargaining and how it works, digital rights and trade unions, something new, just an informal chat. And then the point they were making in the end, the motto was, we need to bring democracy to the workplace. So I think we need to do the same. We need to bring democracy to the internet. We cannot live in this feudal world where the lord of Facebook tells us what we can do, what we cannot do, and the other lord of YouTube is setting up the rules of how we can share information. You were talking about better sharing. That's not better sharing. That's the sharing that YouTube allows you to do if you're lucky, and depending on the algorithm, how they change it. So I think we need to probably, again, rethink. I think the positive ideas that Alex was mentioning before are a good start, and many other collectives have great ideas on how to change that. And we need to put money, we need to put effort, and we need to put people to work on it. And going and mentioning the issue of breaking Facebook or not, I'm more in favor of breaking them, so that's a bit unsurprising, perhaps. So I think this corporation is just too big, just too powerful, more powerful than some states, and they bring that power to the places where laws are made. As Caroline was saying about the pharmaceutical company, that also happens with the tech world. And there are reports of how 90% of, in some cases, of meetings between policymakers happen with the corporate world and not with anyone else, the civil society, librarians, or you know what. And so I think that we need to change it. That's an undemocratic situation. So that's one of the things we need to try to start changing, to make real changes in the world.
Right. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question to Caroline, Alex, or Diego? You can ask them in the chat, or if you want, you're welcome to come on stage. We have about 5
minutes. It is Friday
left.
afternoon. I think people coming on stage is a hurdle.
If there are no questions, I would have one last one for you. And
we have one question from Matthew Rimmer about whether we think Bachelet and company invoking the right to share the benefits of science during the COVID-19 crisis. Although I must say it's not a question that I don't think in a position to answer.
Mm-hmm. Is anyone comfortable answering this? Otherwise, we might take it outside of this conversation, Matthew, and we'll try to give you an answer on the sideline, maybe in the networking section.
Can I react to Jenny's
sure, go
comment
ahead.
in the chat about being really happy too that in the US, finally questions are being asked to big publishers about ebooks, because we've talked about sharing of information and better sharing and all of those things, and going back to my idea of the fact that we're losing rights online. The fact that during the COVID-19 pandemic, publishers were allowed to raise their prices tremendously on ebooks for students in education, in research, etc., just on a whim, because they have a monopoly access, to those books, and they can do whatever they want with libraries, has just been. I knew they were not very nice people on average, but I think during a pandemic, behaving in that way shows very little solidarity in the most awful times. I mean, I have no issues with people being, with companies making a profit. That's what companies do. And if they're not charities, that's fine. But making outrageous profits out of a situation like a pandemic, I think is terrible. And I encourage everyone, by the way, to follow, for example, the hashtag #EbookSOS, which is being used by a campaign in the UK and which documents the misery of librarians trying to meet the needs of students and of researchers in finding affordable ebooks at the moment. It's just awful. So yeah, #EbookSOS, or eBooks SOS, actually. I'm not sure if there's an S at the books. Check both. And it's there. These people have put together some charts about single uses in libraries for ebooks. The prices are just horrible. And I think those are the type of, when we talk about gatekeepers, I think we need to find a situation, and Europe is trying through the DMA, where we address gatekeepers, but we shouldn't think that gatekeepers are just 5 big tech companies. I think there's quite a few gatekeepers out there that merit more attention, and certainly in the publishing world, in the big content world. Let's say there's big tech and there's big content. I mean, if you look at Murdoch Empire, that's also, in my book, that's also a gatekeeper of information to a lot of people to a certain extent. And we really need to address that moving forward if we want the future of the internet to be better, and if we want people to have access to reliable information.
Yes, people are reacting in the chat. I see a lot of +1, so you're getting a lot of support on these points. Is there another question I see in the Q&A that Michelle asked? What do you think we can do about it on an individual level? I'm not sure what you were referring to, Michelle, but maybe you were referring to the big publishers and the control over books. And yeah, I guess these could be maybe your final words. All 3 presenters, I could invite you in the last 3 minutes to say maybe in a sentence or 2, what would be your advice? What can we do to have the internet that we want to see in the future? So I would start with you, Diego.
Yes, so I think on an individual level, you cannot do anything. What you need to do is join a collective. So if something you can do individually is join someone else who is already doing something that you care about. You care about librarians, join the librarians. You care about copyright, join any of the Creative Commons chapters, or talk to Caroline, or talk to us. Digital rights community, we have Alex and Demos. We have lots of people out there doing great things. So that's something you can do. I refrain from advising people, even on privacy issues, to do something individually, like use Signal or use password manager. You should do all of that, but generally, if we want to change things, you need to join a big group, you need to join a position, and you do that by talking to others and joining forces and spending lots of time to make a change. So join someone, join a group, and start doing something this weekend.
Yes.
I think my answer is very similar to Diego's. I think, a friend of mine started recently in the pandemic. She started streaming video games to Amazon's wonderful platform Twitch, and there is somebody who hangs out in her chat for upwards of 12 hours a day, and every time somebody says something offensive to her, he kicks, or he or she, we don't know, kicks them out of the chat. 12 hours a day working on keeping that tiny little bit of the internet better, cleaner. I have the same in WhatsApp groups for local communities. So, I mean, there is a phrase for it. It's called digital civic labor. There's a chap called Nate Matthias who writes about it fantastically. But I think, there is probably opportunity. I think we will always be sharecropping on big tech and the platforms at the moment. But there is value, I think, in If you have a bit of the internet that you really love and you really care about, whether it's your football fan forum, like it might be for me, or my friend's video game stream, if there's somebody out there, if you're willing to spend a bit of time making that place better, safer, make the rules clearer, invite somebody who will add value to it, as Diego says, I think in doing so, we build skills and we recognize what's important about the internet. And then hopefully later down the line, when new technology and new platforms do emerge, as they will do, we'll be ready to go to sort of fill them with all of the good stuff that we are looking for.
And I'll talk like the mom. Turn all your children, your children's friends, every young person you know into an activist that asks for a better internet. All of these kids that, the friends of your own kids, of your nieces or whatever, they might be the children of someone that's building a platform, of a policymaker, etc. And they need to know that they should make all those people accountable for the internet that is being built, that is moving forward, and they deserve a better internet and they should claim it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for these wise words, this great advice. I think this really sums up an hour of very rich conversation. Thank you so much for your time, for speaking with us and sharing your knowledge and your wisdom so generously. This brings us to the end of this conversation, but I've seen you shared your contacts, so hopefully this conversation will continue. It's been a pleasure to host this panel. Thank you very much for coming, and enjoy the last moments of Summit. Bye-bye, everyone.